Harlan Ellison, the man, the myth, the walking firestorm. Welcome back to Science Fiction Now. I am Colin Holmes. Brace yourself. Here comes Harlan Ellison's life, as if an anvil just crashed through your ceiling. Picture a man who wrote at a scream, lived at a shout, and never hesitated to mail dead vermin to bookkeepers who crossed him. Yes, that Harlan Ellison. The science fiction powerhouse whose explosive personality could nuke half a convention hall before his first cup of coffee. If you want some sanitized biography about a quiet scribbler, you're in the wrong sector of the galaxy. This is Ellison the rabble-rouser, the litigious loudmouth, and, infuriatingly, one of SF's most influential writers ever. A bare-knuckle reputation. Harlan Ellison, 1934 to 2018, earned a reputation so combative that even his own dust jacket called him possibly the most contentious person on Earth. Some folks paint him as a gadfly. He preferred troublemaker, or desperado. He relished the label, too. After all, when you spend your career scorching the ground under institutions, editors, and sometimes fans, you might as well enjoy the fireworks. Nothing about Ellison was mild. Author J.G. Ballard summed it up best. He conducts life at a shout and his fiction at a scream. He could be a teddy bear one day, full of wry humor and generosity, and the next, he'd be flipping tables in a rage. Controversial? Absolutely. Essential to speculative fiction? Undeniably. When Ellison died in 2018, his obituaries bore out the tension between the man and his myth. He was hailed as a genius, an innovator, and also a controversial figure, whose long history of inappropriate behavior was as famous as his talent. A eulogy even joked that with Ellison gone, the imminent threat is over, as if the entire sci-fi community could at last breathe easier, like a bomb had finally ticked itself silent. Flaring tempers, famous feuds and incidents. Ellison's rap sheet of "Did he really do that?" moments reads like a mini encyclopedia of creative chaos. He quarreled, he shoved, he lobbed insults like grenades, and yes, sometimes he physically assaulted a colleague. All in a day's work. 1. AggieCon Ruckus, 1969. AggieCon at Texas A&M invited him as guest of honor. Perhaps forgetting Ellison was not exactly big on bowing to campus decorum. He called their corps of cadets America's next generation of Nazis, inciting walkouts and outraged administrators. Rumor has it he also triggered a food fight for good measure. The university nearly cancelled future conventions. They blacklisted him for years, then relented, presumably deciding the dust had settled enough to risk a second go-round. 2. Squaring off with Sinatra. Now we enter the realm of legend. In the mid-1960s, Ellison showed up in boots and casual attire to a Beverly Hills club. Frank Sinatra, who had a known appetite for bulldozing anyone who irked him, decided he didn't like Ellison's clothes. He confronted him, demanded Ellison shape up. The smaller man refused to be cowed, snapping, "I dressed to suit myself." Sinatra huffed. Ellison stared him down, and the onlookers mentally placed bets on how many seconds until Ellison got decked. But Ellison departed unscathed, boasting a tale so iconic you can practically hear "My Way" playing in the background. 3. Nebula Awards Banquet Brawl, 1985. Ever hear about an author at a formal awards ceremony deciding, "Nah, let's choke a fellow writer"? Yep, that was Ellison. In one retelling, he throttled Charles Platt or maybe punched him. It depends on who you ask. They signed a hush-hush, non-aggression pact after. But Ellison, true to form, allegedly bragged about it anyway. Shocker, right? 4. Grabbing Connie Willis, 2006. In the pantheon of gaffes turned outrages, this one stands tall. While on stage at the Hugo Awards, Ellison actually placed his hand on Connie Willis's breast, ostensibly as a joke. Sci-Fi fandom exploded in fury, labeling it a gross, invasive stunt. Ellison claimed he apologized. Willis never acknowledged it. Many fans still reference that moment when enumerating Ellison's worst offenses. The litigious crusader. If Ellison wasn't physically shoving you, he might be slapping you with lawsuits. He defended his creative turf like a junkyard dog, sometimes heroically, sometimes vexingly. Copyright vigilante. He sued ABC and Paramount over alleged plagiarism of his story, Brillo, and the court sided with him. Then there's the legendary smackdown involving the Terminator. Ellison claimed it drew from his Outer Limits episode Soldier. The production company settled out of court, coughed up a sum, and appended acknowledgement to the works of Harlan Ellison in the film credits. James Cameron grumbled, but the credit remains. No one was safe, not even Marvel Comics. When he spotted an issue of The Incredible Hulk that suspiciously mirrored Soldier, Ellison stormed in, demanded justice, and received a writing credit plus the same payment the comics writer got. Marvel also threw in a lifetime subscription to sweeten the truce. If you reached for Ellison's intellectual pocket, he'd snap it shut on your wrist. Defamation duels. Some misadventures took him to court over name-calling. Comics writer Michael Fleischer sued Ellison for describing him in fairly unflattering terms, like bugfuck. A jury ultimately decided Ellison's flamboyant barbs were protected opinion. Then he went after Fantagraphics for how they portrayed him in a historical account. All's fair in love and lawsuits. Eventually, that squabble settled too. Digital takedowns. Many folks shrug about online piracy. Ellison was not among them. He was hounding fans, websites, and AOL itself over unauthorized postings of his material long before such fights were common. He sued, he yelled, and he forced settlement deals. His stance was simple. Pay the writer, or I'll come for you. And come he did, in all his scalp-hunting glory. Fans hailed him as a champion for creator rights. Others found him a litigious blowhard. You decide which side you're on. The infamous Dead Gopher. It'd be criminal not to mention the famous Dead Gopher Incident. Possibly the single best demonstration of Ellison's creative approach to vengeance. Legend says a publisher's office drone stalled on royalty payments and stonewalled Ellison's calls. Ellison, vexed and vengeful, procured a dead gopher, packaged it, and mailed it via the slowest postal option known to humankind. By the time the unsuspecting desk jockey opened the parcel, it smelled like the apocalypse. Gaiman himself confirmed the story's veracity. Whether you admire the audacity or recoil in horror, it's peak Ellison. Contempt turned into performance art. Warped bridges in Hollywood. From time to time, Ellison ventured into Hollywood. The collisions could be spectacular. After Star Wars Mania in 1977, Warner Brothers courted him to adapt Isaac Asimov's I, Robot. Naturally, an executive, who apparently hadn't even read Ellison's script, critiqued it. Ellison responded by comparing the exec's intellect to an artichoke. The studio fired him on the spot. He later published his screenplay as a book, so the fans could see exactly what he had in mind. It was a pattern. Ellison refused to water down his standards for studios, censors, or incompetent suits. His conflicts with Star Trek were similarly storied. He wrote The City on the Edge of Forever, widely hailed as one of the show's finest episodes, but he and Gene Roddenberry spent decades sniping over rewrites, cuts, and royalties. Ellison made sure to let everyone know which lines he wrote, and which were meddled with. The great Last Dangerous Visions Debacle. A fiasco in epic form, The Last Dangerous Visions was Ellison's planned third entry in his groundbreaking anthology series. The first two, Dangerous Visions and again, Dangerous Visions, shook the science fiction world by introducing cutting-edge, taboo-busting stories. The third was promised in the early 70s. It never materialized. Writers who'd submitted stories waited, and eventually withdrew in frustration. Christopher Priest hammered Ellison publicly, calling him out for stringing everyone along. Ellison, naturally, took offense. Threats and insults flew. The anthology remains a legendary what-if of the genre. Forever delayed, never published, overshadowed by grudges on all sides. Conducting life at a shout, his impact on SF. Ellison's fractious reputation can overshadow the reason people tolerated him in the first place. He was ferociously good. In the 1960s and 70s, Ellison was a key figure in science fiction's new wave, demanding that writers push boundaries in style, theme, and subject matter. He championed social commentary, adult themes, and raw emotion. No more safe rocket ships and squeaky clean ray guns. He'd famously marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and opposed the Vietnam War, funneling that activism and moral fervor into stories that could sear your conscience. His best-known works, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, or Repent Harlequin, said the TikTokman, jolt readers awake with nightmarish intensity. They're stories about oppression, rebellion, and the howling rage of a man who refuses to let authority crush him. His teleplay, The City on the Edge of Forever, remains Star Trek's crowning achievement, heartbreak and all. When Ellison wasn't busy battling suits in the studio, he was insisting that scriptwriters be treated fairly. He demanded respect for the written word at a time when Hollywood often viewed writers as disposable. Despite all the acrimony, many big names in science fiction, Octavia Butler, Samuel R. Delany, J.G. Ballard, owe Ellison a debt. He promoted younger writers, championed them, gave them a stage or a stern pep talk when no one else cared. If he burned an anthology or two to the ground, well, he also nurtured some of the field's greatest talents. Ellison on the page, no filter, full volume. Much of Ellison's famed turbulence ends up distilled in his prose. He didn't flinch from outrage, he aimed to instill it. You see it in I have no mouth and I must scream, where a sadistic AI tortures the last survivors of humanity, or in Repent, Harlequin, said the TikTokman, where a merry anarchist sticks his tongue out at a rigid, punctual dystopia. These works pulse with Ellison's unfiltered fury at injustice. Reading them can be bracing, like a slap, a shout, or a dare. He also wrote scathing introductions and essays that took aim at censors, naysayers, and uptight gatekeepers who told people not to ruffle feathers. Ellison ruffled them anyway, cackling all the while. He believed that shocking an audience was a sign you'd broken through the sedation of daily life. And if someone complained he was just trying to get a rise, he'd grin, precisely, concluding the controlled detonation. Harlan Ellison was never a half measure. He fought vigorously for writers' rights, then turned around and left fans or peers bruised by physical or verbal collisions. He demanded that science fiction grow up, and it did, in part because he kicked its complacent shins so hard. He wrote essential stories, yet left the community to grapple with the moral fallout of stunts like the Connie Willis Incident. Love or loathe him, it's impossible to unsee him. He's the guy who dared to stand up to Frank Sinatra, and also groped a colleague on stage. He's the unstoppable champion who forced studios to pay writers fairly, and the unstoppable bully who'd call you an artichoke brain if you crossed him. He's the stinging conscience behind SF's transformation into a more progressive, risk-taking field. Ellison's seat of the pants, scorched-the-earth lifestyle guaranteed that, even in death, his name rings out as loud as any controversy he ever courted. Ultimately, the field is richer and more complicated for his presence. If anyone's expecting him to rest in peace, they might be better off expecting him to tear holes in the afterlife with a new set of cosmic feuds. That's Harlan Ellison for you. Irascible, brilliant, vexing, and unforgettable. Forever conducting his legend at a shout and his fiction at a scream.